as we examine the younger generation born after 1980. This one is the panel most appropriate, I guess, for the city in which we meet, Washington, because it's about how young people perceive politics and government, what their views are on the issues of the day, and how they choose to engage in political life or not. When I traveled around the United States in the midterm election year 2006, and again this year, looking to see how the younger generation was being affected by the recession, and when I say this year, I'm really talking about last 2009, I found some strong views, I found a surprising confidence, and even a bit of wisdom. Here's a minute's worth of what we found.
We have to be wiser with our decisions than and how we handle things with the economy, with energy, than previous generations have.
We grew up with things like Will and Grace,
right,
and having that in the comfort of our home, and so we've grown up with it, and it's been a part of our lives, and it's not groundbreaking in the least bit to have interracial couples.
Our generation seriously thinks that no matter what comes to you, there's an answer to your problem.
That's right, an answer to your problem, and you can find it right here in Washington, D.C. Well, with us is yet another excellent panel of individuals uniquely qualified to talk about our topic, all of whom I am sure are going to have those answers. Let's meet them, starting with Matt Bai, and I'm going to ask them to come up and take a seat as I introduce them. Matt is the contributing politics writer for the New York Times Magazine, where he covered both the 2004 and the 2008 presidential campaigns. He has done much commented upon cover stories, including on President Obama's health care strategy. And he has written often about issues of generational change in American politics and society. His book, The Argument, was about the rise of the first Internet age political movement. Eli Pariser founded a website in the aftermath of the September 11th terror attacks, and then at the ripe age of 20, he helped to oversee its merger with the progressive organization MoveOn.org, which the New York Times Magazine called the mainstream arm of the peace movement. He led MoveOn to become the first place where large numbers of small donations could be mobilized through online engagement. He is now president of MoveOn's board. Reihan Salam. Reihan, where are you? Come on up. Is a fellow and a policy advisor for the New America Foundation and the author of the much acclaimed 2008 book titled Grand New Party: How Conservatives Can Win the Working Class and Save the American Dream. Reihan writes about politics, about culture, and about technology. He's a columnist for Forbes.com and for the Daily Beast. And from Pew, our two panelists who will be making the presentation of their survey findings. First, Michael Dimmock. Where are you, Mike? Come on up. Associate Director for Research at the Pew Research Center. He is principally responsible for the development of the center's research projects, including questionnaire design and data analysis. He has published multiple articles on public opinion, voting behavior, and survey methodology. And Scott Keeter, a Director of Survey Research here at the Pew Research Center and co-author of 4 books, including A New Engagement, ? Political Participation, Civic Life, and the Changing American Citizen, which included special focus on the younger generation compared to its elders. Scott has also written on political communications and behavior, and since 1980, he's been an election night analyst of exit polls for NBC News. Now, after Scott and Michael finish, the panel will talk, again, same pattern. We're going to talk for about 45 minutes, just the panel, and then we're going to turn to you in the audience. Scott Keeter, you are on first.
Thank you, Judy, and good afternoon, everybody. First, I'm going to start with something that isn't news, and that is that the millennials made a big splash in 2008. Everybody knows that. According to the exit polls, the level of support for the Democratic candidate by young people was, relative to the votes of everybody else, was greater. That disparity was greater in 2008 than it has ever been in the history of exit polling. 66% of the millennial generation voted for Barack Obama in 2008 versus only about 53% of the voting public overall. And as you can see in the right-hand pair of bars, that difference there is quite large compared with other years. But even before 2008, the millennials were looking like a very strong Democratic constituency. 54% of them voted for John Kerry in 2004. That was his best age group. And 60% of them voted for Democratic candidates for Congress in the 2006 congressional elections. So one thing that we can take away from this is that while the millennials really like Barack Obama, and they still like him, and they voted for him at very high levels, their impact on politics over the past several years was not just about Obama. They are not an Obama phenomenon. Their liberalism and democratic leanings predate Obama. Now, aside from how they voted in these elections, another notable aspect was their level of engagement in terms of voter turnout. The gap between voter turnout between younger and older voters has been quite large over the past 30 or 40 years. This is a couple of pictures, lines showing you voter turnout among people in the 18 to 29 age group and people 30 and older going back to 1972 at the time that 18 to 20-year-olds got the vote. The gap through this period, at least since about 1980, has been quite sizable, 20 percentage points or more. And there was evidence going up to the 2000 election that this gap was actually getting wider rather than narrower. There was an uptick in voter turnout in the very engaging presidential election of 1992, but after that you really had a very wide gap reaching 25 points in the 2000 election. But in the 2004 election, young people turned out at a significantly higher level. Their voter turnout overall rose from 40 percentage points to 49%. The voter turnout of older people went up a little bit as well, but not by nearly as much, with the result that the gap between younger and older people in terms of turnout narrowed to 19 points. And then in the 2008 election, the gap narrowed again, not as dramatically as the difference between 2000 and 2004, but there was some uptick in turnout among young people and maybe even a little bit of a downtick among older people, with the result that the gap stood at 16 percentage points in 2008. Well, what is it that it really accounts for this movement of young people towards the Democratic Party through this period, as well as their high level of engagement in politics? As you've heard today, this is a very diverse generation, racially and ethnically. And that, of course, matters politically because non-whites, as we've heard earlier, are more likely to vote Democratic. And just to give you a sense of how much the electorate of young people changed between 2000 and 2008, I have a couple of statistics from the exit polls. In 2008, just 62% of young voters were white, 62%. 18% of them were black, 14% were Hispanic, and others of mixed race or other races. By comparison, 8 years earlier, nearly three-quarters of young voters were white. So from 74% in 2000 down to 62% white in 2008. But even more than race and ethnicity, the millennial generation has very different values in many important politically relevant respects compared with their elders. Before I show you some of the trends that we've documented in these values, let me say a word about how we know what we know about these things. The Center has been tracking American political values for over 20 years. Starting in 1987, the Times Mirror Center conducted a series of studies on American political values where we asked upwards of 80 questions in a survey touching on areas such as culture, race, government, foreign, military affairs, and the like. We've taken in each of the surveys that we've conducted these questions and we've separated them by subject area, and then we've made summary indexes of the values in like related areas so that we can track movement of attitudes over time using exactly the same methods. And we've done this in order to do such analyses as a comparison of the values of Democrats and Republicans. And so a couple of years ago, we documented how much more polarized American politics had become. The values of Democrats and Republicans had gotten further apart over time. We can do the same thing with generations. Because we've asked these questions 14 times since 1987 in exactly the same way, we can actually take the generations, not just the age groups, but the people according to their birth cohorts, and we can track them when they first appear in our survey, and then we can follow them over time in a process that's called a cohort analysis. That way we can see not only how a particular birth cohort is changing in response to the events of the moment, but then when a new cohort comes in, we can see where they stand on these value questions compared with not only their elders at that point in time, but also at earlier generations when they were the same ages. So hopefully that will become clear when I show you a couple of the charts that we have. Let me start with the area where I think we see the greatest difference between younger and older cohorts, and that's on social and cultural values. Here we're talking about questions relating to the acceptance of homosexuality, interracial dating, expanded roles for women, immigrants, and the like. And there are a lot of different questions that can go into this. This particular index has about 5 items. So here are the trends. The first line that I have up there, this sort of yellowish line, is the silent generation, the oldest of the cohorts that we're tracking here. If I put the greatest generation, born even before the silent generation, up there, the line would be even higher. Now, on this particular chart, lines that are high on the page will be conservative social values, and as we add more lines, you'll see there's an increasing liberal trend. So this is the line for the baby boomers. So even when we first started, they were already fully established as a birth cohort in our surveys, and they were significantly less conservative than the silent generation. And also, as you can see over time, there hasn't been a lot of change. In other words, the line isn't going up or down particularly, so social values of the sort that we're measuring there have only moved a little bit. They've become a little more liberal, but not a whole lot. This is Generation X. When they first appear as a full birth cohort in 1994, they too are more liberal socially, less conservative socially, and while there's some bumps up and down, they continue to be distinctive from the other 2 cohorts. That's the Millennial Generation, the orange line. They are by far the least socially conservative generation, and it looks like that's going to be the pattern that's going to continue if what we've seen in the past bears up. In another area, one that's very important politically, we have a set of questions that tap attitudes about government, attitudes towards whether government should be doing more, whether government is inefficient and wasteful or does a better job than we generally think that it does. And on this one, the higher lines are going to be the more liberal positions. So we start out again with the silent generation, and you see that while there have been ups and downs, there's a little dip in the line there about a third of the way through. That's 1994, when everybody was pretty conservative. That's the baby boom. They started out somewhat more liberal in terms of support for government than the silent generation, but they have really converged with the silent generation over time, with their views coming closer to theirs. That's Generation X, even more supportive than the baby boomers, although when they first arrived, it was in the very anti-government sentiment of 1994, and that's the Millennial Generation. So we don't see enormous differences across the cohorts, but they are pretty consistent, and they've remained fairly distinctive, again with the exception of the baby boomers and the silent generation converging in the last couple of times that we've done these surveys. Now, we've done a lot of these, and I won't take up the time that I think we want to have here for further discussion about some of the implications of what we'll present. telling you about other value dimensions. But young people do stand out on some other ones, especially on questions relating to equal rights and even affirmative action. You can see that, again, there's the same pattern of the older generations being somewhat more conservative, less supportive of equal rights and affirmative action, and the millennials being the most liberal. On some other issues that we've tracked, we don't see particular differences. For example, attitudes about business are not very different across the generations and don't seem to be taking any particular tack. One of the oddest things, I think, from our work over the past few years is that even with the terrible recession and the fury that's been aimed at Wall Street, general attitudes about business in our 2009 survey, taken in the teeth of all of this, did not show a particular uptick in anti-business sentiment. And the same was true for the millennials. If I showed you that graphic, the lines would actually just be all clustered together. Similarly, we don't see very big differences among the generations in attitudes about the social safety net. And so there are some areas in which young people and older people don't differ too much. One final one I'll mention in which we have seen a little bit of a difference actually emerging this past year are attitudes about the use of military force. Young people have been showing somewhat greater reluctance to use military force. They are actually somewhat less satisfied with the way Obama is handling the situation in Afghanistan. They're more opposed to the increase in troop levels there than other generations. But over time, we haven't seen a lot of differences on this particular set of value questions. Now, what we have seen here are some differences that are interesting and certainly politically relevant. And as we can see for some of them, these things have persisted. But not everything is immutable. And the past year has been a particularly challenging one for the Democratic Party. For a look at what's happened to the millennial generation and their attachment to the Democrats, I'll hand the clicker over to my colleague, Michael Dimmock.
Great. Thanks, Scott. I think the themes that I'm picking up from the sessions today are that, there really are values that millennials hold that set them apart, that there's a characteristic, there's a profile of this generation that's interesting, that is shaped by demography, it's shaped by sort of sociology, in listening to Neil Howe, it's shaped by the environment that they're arriving into. And the question from a political perspective is, how does that play out now and into the future as a voting bloc? And we started this conference with Andy and Scott reminding us that this is a generation that's already felt a little bit of political power and influence in recent elections. Can Democrats count on that kind of support from this generation now and into the future? The suggestion from these slides Scott's showing us is that these characteristics in terms of values tend to be sticky. In other words, while the mood of the public or the values of the public may ebb and flow towards government over time, the relative distance between generations tends to stay. And so the characteristics of this generation relative to others are likely to be robust. Does that mean that this is that suggests that this is a generation that ought to be favorable to the Democrats now and into the future if those values differences do persist? But are they going to be able to hold on to 2-to-1 margins like they had in 2008 and count on that from this generation as a voting bloc? Let's use 2008 as a jumping off point, and then I'll talk a little bit about what we're seeing already in terms of what this means. What I'm doing here is I'm taking the data we collected in 2008, and I'm sort of taking a cross-section of the public. So across the bottom in our ridiculously small fonts here, we've laid out the youngest people over on the left and the oldest people over on the right. So I've taken a cross-section of the electorate in the year 2008. And the point of this is to show how distinctive the millennials are. The millennials are over on the left, and this is the balance of party identification in all of the polling that we conducted over the course of the year. Among the millennials, 62% either called themselves Democrats. We say, do you consider yourself a Democrat, Republican, or independent? And if you're independent, we say, well, do you lean more towards the Democrats or more towards the Republicans? These are sort of standard metrics. And one of the values is we can trend them over time. 62% of young people either identified or lean Democratic, 30% identify or lean Republican, mirroring, of course, the outcome of the election, a 2-to-1 margin for Barack Obama. And you see that's pretty distinctive. You know, the break points aren't exactly along the generational lines that we're using here for analytical purposes, but quite distinctive from the other generations. One of the reasons I start with this kind of unusual cross-sectional approach to thinking about it is it's a way of thinking about what the future might look like. Because basically, as time passes, these generations are going to move to the right along this graph, right? And are the young people going to be a pig in the python, so to speak, a big democratic bubble that just persists as they get older into the generation? And it's interesting to look back at some of the older generations in this chart. You can kind of see in the middle of the baby boomers, there's a little hump sort of around the middle of that chart. These are folks in their mid to late 50s right now. That's sort of the folks who really were coming of age in the late Vietnam years, in the Watergate era. This was a very democratic generation when they first came into the electorate. Gallup polls conducted in 1974, when these folks were in their 20s and late teens, showed a 47% to 17% Democratic advantage in identification. That's even more overwhelming than what we're seeing right now among millennials. Not necessarily surprising given the circumstances and the context. You still see some echo of that Democratic advantage in this group, but it's certainly more muted than it was in the peak moment of 1974. And the question looking forward, I think, is 2008 a kind of peak moment like that defines a generation, shapes a generation, but is it always going to remain that distinct and that separate from the rest of the population? Let me switch this a little bit to more traditional plot of the balance of party identification in the electorate over the last 10 years. So here we're going from 2000 on the left over to 2008 right now. And this is, in the bold lines, the balance of party identification, including leaners, among millennials. And you see that even when we first start measuring them in 2003, 2004, they're already more Democratic than the rest of the public, which is shown with the lighter dashed lines. Apropos to Scott's point, right from the start, they were showing value differences from the rest of the public, and were already voting more Democratic in 04 and 06. But that by 2008, which I highlighted here, because that's the cross where I took the cross section I just showed you, we see that getting even more extreme. The gap between millennials and the rest of the public gets even wider to that 62 to 30% margin. Already, as Scott prefaced, 2009 has been a somewhat rougher year for Democrats in terms of their image. You know, Obama's ratings are down from what were potentially particular highs at the start of his presidency. What's happened to the balance of party ID over the course of the past year is a convergence, again, a kind of return to where we were in the earlier part of the 2000s. But that the movement, the sort of ebbing of Democratic fortunes has been particularly notable among the millennials themselves. The proportion of millennials who identify or lean Democratic has fallen from 62% in 2008 as a whole to 54% in the fourth quarter of 2009. To kind of give more texture to this, we've broken 09 into quarters, because really the Democratic losses started to take place in the later part of 2009 as a year. The percent identifying or leaning Republican has already bounced up from 30% in 2008 to 40% at the fourth quarter of 2009. And the thing to keep in mind behind all of this is that, you know, the values are likely stable. We haven't updated all the values trends every year, but that political events matter, you know, and the environment and the circumstances of 2008 were extreme. You had a change candidate who represented youthfulness and diversity by his very nature. You had an extremely unpopular incumbent president to younger people who rejected many of the things that George W. Bush stood for. That created an environment that was really, you know, set where young people could get mobilized and were very sort of strong in their Democratic leaning. The other thing that's important to keep in mind behind this is I am tracking in these slides Democrats and Democratic leaners, and I've sort of blurred that distinction, but it's not an irrelevant one. The plurality of young people are independents. When we say, do you think of yourself as a Democrat, Republican, or independent, they're saying independent by very wide margins. Now, that's characteristic of youth. That's not unusual. But Democrats never really closed the deal with young people through this period. Even in 2008, young millennials were no more likely to call themselves Democrats than any other generation. They were just more likely to lean Democratic than other generations. They never really fully pulled into the political party, and the erosion that you're seeing here reflects that sort of lack of firm attachment to the party. The counterpoint to that is the Republican Party, even though you're seeing this 10-point rise here, that's mostly a rise, again, in leaning, not people who right out of the gate call themselves Republicans. The Republican Party has had a very difficult time getting traction among this generation. Even in this fourth quarter of 2009, only 24% of the millennials think of themselves as Republicans. That's a very low number and hasn't really come up even from 2008. So to the extent that 09 gives us a launching point to think about the future, 2010 and beyond, I think is where we can move on.
Okay. Michael Demick, thanks. We've got three people I want to turn to right away on some of the points you just made, but I want to pick up with this final question and turn to Eli Pariser. This notion that in less than a year, in the course of a year, that Democratic leaning, that Democratic attraction has taken a dramatic hit. Does that square with your understanding of what's happened, what you see and feel out there among grassroots supporters of Move On?
Well, I would say that
among young people.
And I was thinking about this for this panel because I think I'm 14 days short of being a millennial, actually. 1980, December 17th.
They'll probably let you in.
Yeah,
Honorary.
I'm knocking on the door. So, among, and Move On actually over the course of 2008 added about 2 million new members, many of whom were young, many of whom were millennials. My main thought on this actually goes to something that I think you wrote recently about the kind of malleable, movable.
Just going to steal my points now?
Yeah, no.
What am I going to say? What am I going to talk about?
This is remix culture, Matt.
Right.
You know, the fact that I think history will show, but I'm not sure that the kind of allegiance to brands as a lifelong commitment in general is as true of this group as of previous groups. I think, I would expect to see more variance and 2008 as a high point, but a lot of variance in real time as people are adjusting to a very quickly changing world, and that kind of flexibility, I think, is a characteristic of this group. So I don't think that. I think there's something real happening there. I also think that it's less, it may be less significant than it looks when you're looking at other generations that change much more slowly.
From the other perspective, Rehan, from the perspective of conservatives, Republicans, whatever in the label, whether you call it, Republican, conservative, or what, it improved. The picture improved. But as we just heard Michael say, there's still this reluctance to happily attach the label. It's of Republican. It's leaning.
Funny story. So the term that we use, conservatism, to describe this political tendency, Bill Buckley, when he wrote God and Man at Yale, called it individualism. And then later on, someone gave it the name conservatism to associate it with this kind of older American tradition. But the name was a little arbitrary in a way. And you see a lot of folks who call themselves progressives now who would have called themselves liberals in another generation. When you look at Democratic identifiers circa the 1960s, think about what that meant. What that meant if you were living in the Deep South and you were identifying as a member of the Democratic Party, or were you in the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. It means a lot of different things. So we look at these seemingly stable categories over a long period of time, and they're useful, they're helpful in some ways. They describe certain things usefully and other things less usefully. But I think that, the thing is, these categories actually are quite unstable. They mean different things at different times. And I think that that's the thing that I think of as most distinctive about this moment and also about this generation. So you can have someone who described themselves as a Democrat, as a diehard Democrat in 1974, Watergate baby, someone who kind of looked at the world in that particular way. Then when they were voting for Bill Clinton in 1992, this person was perhaps in a very different class position. They had a different mix of issues that they cared about, et cetera. And they lived in a different part of the country. So I think that that's one thing to keep in mind. I think that when you're looking at these kind of broad contours of American ideological change, we talked about social liberalism and social conservatism, and about how that's changed over time. Well, you have lots of dispute about, for example, views on abortion and a lot of other little things like that. One thing that you see, though, is that this generation considers those social issues somewhat less politically salient. They're less intense voting issues than they were for somewhat older folks. And then also another thing to think about is, are you a social liberal or a social conservative if you embrace the views of everyone who's around you, your family, everyone in your neighborhood, everyone who is, kind of shares your broad sensibility? So what kind of impulse is that? We call that liberal because that way you're both a liberal if you live in Austin, Texas, or, Sugar Land, Texas, if you have these particular sets of views. But in terms of your sensibility, the way that you approach the world, the way that you think about things, are you someone who actually breaks the mold? Are you someone who is a contrarian by nature? It actually doesn't tell you all that much. And I think that when you're looking at our politics right now, I think that the really interesting comparison is to a moment like the late 60s. You saw a magazine like The Public Interest, and there was Bill Kristol, and there was Daniel Bell, and then there was Charles Reich. Charles Reich then wrote The Greening of America and became a kind of hero to the hippies. And then Bill Kristol became a kind of avid defender of Nixon. You have this moment of incredible political discontinuity right now. And so I can't tell you what's going to happen to these different partisan identifiers or what have you. What I can tell you is that realignments ain't what they used to be. You used to see a realignment, and it would last for a long period of time, and now things seem to be moving a lot faster. This is a kind of view that Matt has raised, among others.
Now there's really nothing left from me.
I'm sorry. So I just kind of caution us to kind of think a little bit about, kind of what these categories mean, how they're shifting. When I think of Move On, I think of a group that actually is a funny mix of things. It's a civil society group that is partisan in some respects, but it's also a group that's not. It's a different kind of special interest group, and I think that they're very explicit about that. And then when you look at what's happening in the Tea Party movement, how do these guys feel about an issue like Afghanistan? How are they going to feel about an issue like that 6 months from now? If you think you know the answer to that, then you know a heck of a lot more than I do. But
all right, Matt, we're going to finally let you have a word here.
Let me just. That was exceptionally insightful on this, I think. But when we talk about generational change, I'm not a social scientist, so just looking at it from the sort of dumbed down perspective of journalism. When you talk about generational change, right, it's not actually where you, and I'm sure you guys would agree with me, it's not a flip of a switch. If you're 20 to 32, you're in this category, and you're 33. It happens very gradually, and it permeates those boundaries. So I would submit that this president, right, is actually on the leading edge. He's a few years older than I am. He just makes the boom, but nobody really would put him in that category, right? He's on the leading edge of a much broader generational shift happening in the country that, as you filter down to what we're calling millennials, is much more distilled and apparent, but is really happening from a much older age level down. And it can be looked at, as having a variety. It can be looked at as having a variety of characteristics. I think the defining characteristic of that generational change, and it's social and it's cultural and it's technological, is this breakdown of loyalty to institutions, generally, because this probably has its roots in the Watergate period, right, and in the questioning of government generally, which brought a lot of boomers and people just older than the boomers, like President Obama, into political consciousness. We see it's probably affected by scandals in trusted institutions like steroids in baseball or the Catholic Church, the failure of companies like General Motors, the failure of the banks, and it's certainly technological in the sense that you don't. The internet has really broken down institutional hegemony. I mean, I just went and got a mortgage for another house. I mean, you don't go to the bank. You go online. It took me 5 minutes to compare all the rates. Some guy called me up right away, and you start the process. I mean, Daniel Pink, the writer, has called us free agent nation. I think that's a great term. I would actually say we're a nation of comparative shoppers in a sense. I mean, that is the ethos of this generation and the generations to a certain extent that are older. So anybody who lives their lives online. So as you point out, what that means is that that's going to obviously translate to party loyalty. It means that while you can ask people what their party identification is, and as you point out, they're going to mostly be independent, and then you kind of nudge them ever so gently into a camp, you can't really figure out how their view of identification to a party is different from somebody else's. And I think just based on their attitudes about institutions, they're going to be It's not surprising to me at all that you would lose 8 points in a quarter or whatever it is, because they're going to move around. I think they really liked Obama a lot. I think they will identify with personalities. I think the opposite was true with Bush. I think they are repelled by personalities. But whether or not that creates an institutional loyalty, I think it probably does not. And so I do think we're going to have, as Raheem says, a faster movement of realignments. And it's why, Democrats who are shocked now say, wow, we had this 40-year realignment going in 2008. It was all set. And I remember doing panels like this one where people said, we're going to have a 40-year, this is a Rooseveltian realignment. And 2 years later, they can't understand how they're battling to keep the House. It should show you the stupidity of making grand pronouncements. Because in fact, our realignments aren't going to be 40 years. They're going to be 40 months if you're super lucky, maybe 40 days, maybe 40 minutes, depending on what's happening on cable news.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, let me speak to
Eli.
One other piece of, I think, what's going on here, which is, I think this is a generation, we are a generation, tuned into form and as well as content. So, participation in institutions, in ideas, in political life is actually kind of baked into the structures that we're familiar with. Before I went on this yesterday, I posted to my Facebook page, what should I say on the panel at the Millennials Conference, and I got like 30 comments, so I don't have to actually do any thinking. But and one of them was about this thing about that part of what's going on is the Obama campaign was a form that was very familiar to these people. It was an open forum. You could go on, you could form groups, you could find other people. This looks a lot like Facebook. It feels like the kind of stuff we know. The Obama government, has had trouble creating a form of government that feels as participatory as as the campaign was for many of us who were part of it.
So all the government needs to do is all the White House is become an extension of Facebook.
That's right. I think Facebook, White House, and actually they are trying to do this, and I think it does change. Barack Obama appears in my friend feed every 6 days and has a little pronouncement or something, and it's interesting. It's not quite right because I think the other piece is about authenticity. And I know that that's some, person in the DNC typing that in, and not actually the president. But but that does. But actually, in some ways, false authenticity is worse than no than just staying out of those spaces.
Scott and Michael, help us dig a little bit deeper into what was this attachment to Obama and the Democrats in 2008 all about? How much of it was the person and the Facebook manifestation, whatever, and how much of it was something deeper or longer lasting?
I think the points that have been made about the way in which the campaign was run, speaking to the way in which young people were thinking and interacting, are very good ones. And so in that sense, I think there was something special about Obama, if not personally, about the way he ran the campaign, that made young people a more important part of the campaign effort than it might have been had Hillary Clinton prevailed. But I'm also a fairly strong believer that based on the value profiles and the issue attitudes that we saw, attitudes about the wars and so forth, that Hillary Clinton would have done about as well as Obama did in terms of the split of the vote. But in terms of the energy that was put behind the campaign, that may have depended partly on the personality of Obama and who he was as a person, and also upon the way in which he ran the campaign.
You think she would have done as well as he did among younger voters?
I think it would have been very similar, simply because we saw 60% of them vote for Democratic candidates in the House races in 2006. And sure, there were plenty of charismatic candidates, but there were probably plenty that were not. And they, young people disproportionately gave their votes to the Democrats.
I think what a lot of people are interested in is getting at what is the sticky part of that, for the Democrats. What is it that young people can be counted on to continue to like about what they see Democrats doing, and what is it that Republicans can can come in and, whether they're leaning Republican or whatever, can come in and hope to pick off. Who wants to, explore that a little bit?
I mean, one thought is that we kind of have this funny situation in which we have two conservative parties right now in the United States, and by that I mean conservative in terms of sensibility. You saw this year the Republicans do something that, ironically, a lot of so-called Republican reformers advocated for a long time, which is you saw the party respond to their constituency, and their constituency is old. They're white, and if you're looking at incumbent legislators who want to win re-election, they were very keenly aware of the fact that they feel very strongly about Medicare. Now, the same exact kind of trimming of the growth of Medicare that Republicans pursued in the 1990s as a way of financing tax cuts and a variety of other measures were pretty strongly attacked to become a bedrock principle. Jim DeMint, the great tribune of the Tea Party movement, has explicitly said that protecting our, kind of the agreement, the pledge that we made to seniors is vitally important. So you have this one political party that, given its demographic balance, is racked by this kind of deep contradiction. And then you have another political party that is conservative in a subtly different but also important sense. The Democrats are very interested in kind of minimizing the kind of economic pain that you're seeing over the course of this recession for lots of good and complicated reasons. Whereas in the early 1980s, Reagan, who many people compare Obama to, made this very different deal. Reagan and Volcker basically, kind of engineered an incredibly punishing recession that led to liquidation of a lot of sectors, et cetera. This very different thing. But that was an era when you had lots of Americans who remember the Depression, or who remembered what we forget now, which is that in that early part of the 50s or right after the war, there was a huge it was a very different period of some privation, tremendous anxiety, and a sense that, this is something that can happen. And now we're in this era of the great moderation. The Millennial Generation hasn't experienced a wrenching recession. This is what it is to them. And so I think that creates a kind of affluence trap, in which actually some of the things that we want to see in terms of real transformative change, whether you're on the far left or the far right, actually are just not possible. People have too much to give up right now, particularly people who are under 30 who kind of have no real subjective experience of what really wrenching economic change is like. And I think that is actually a big player in how our politics will likely play out. And it's one reason why it's not the filibuster or something like that. I think that's the reason why really big ticket dramatic reforms are just going to be very hard and will only happen when there's a perception of real exigency.
And Matt Bai, how disillusioning is that to young people who, whether you put them high or low on a scale of idealism?
Well, I mean, I had to think about this while, looking at the numbers and having read the report before, is you all do about as much as you can do to try and put the generations in context to one another. But, the truth is, young Americans have been liberal since, the first caveman started an anti-spear campaign. And they've been disillusioned since that time as well. And this is like a hallmark.
But isn't this one more liberal than other generations were? I'm asking. I don't know. Is that true, Scott?
It's a little hard to say. I mean, as I said, in 1974, boomers were extremely democratic, certainly. Even back in the 50s, the silent generation leaned very heavily Democratic, more so than today. So there is some sign that there's that. And the Xers, in some way, are the outlier in all of that. Even when Xers were in their teens and early 20s, they were coming of age in that late Reagan era where things looked good. We had won the Cold War. The economy had come back from those early recessions. And that imprint has really stuck with that generation. So it's not a universal, but I think it does.
So you certainly have to put it in when you put it in relation to where the society is on a lot of these attitudes, right? It certainly it may be constant. But I do think this point about the economic situation is very interesting. You guys pointed out in the numbers early on the attitudes toward banks and business hadn't changed. I noticed another number in your report about millennials feeling actually quite confident about their economic futures. What was it? Something like 9 in 10 who thought they were at some point at least going to have enough money to do the things they want to do. I once, Gary Hart, who I've spent some time talking to for my next book, told me once that he thought in his worst moments he feared it would take a depression to change the political dynamic that Raheem was talking about, where we could get sort of broad changes to updating and changes to our social contract, to our slate of policies. He may be right, and if he is, I think this is why we're understanding now that this recession, bad as it is, wrenching it is not in fact a depression, because you look at the millennial attitudes toward business and toward their own expectations, and you see that it has actually not shaken the foundation of attitudes in the country, and probably that has something to do with the yawing inequality that we saw, were intensified during the Bush years. That this recession has had as wrenching as it is, has had a disproportionate effect on people at one end of the income level, but actually a relatively mild effect on people at the other end of the income level. It is not a we're all in the same boat, and it's time to reevaluate our bedrock ideas kind of moment that we understand the Great Depression to have been, and I think those comparisons are overwrought.
So, Eli, what is that? Or go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, and as Paul pointed out in his introductory slides, the unemployment is affecting this generation arguably more than any other, and right now they're kind of rolling with it, and they're going to school and they're doing things. But if this is a long, drawn-out period of unemployment and they don't feel change and any answer or solution to that, that's certainly a point of frustration. And it's not necessarily a liberal or conservative issue at that point. It's a who's in charge right now and why aren't they addressing my problems kind of issue.
Yeah.
So, I think just to get all of the pieces on the table here, I think one other piece that we can't ignore is the previous president. And, a lot of this is sort of mischaracterized as unique attributes of the Bush administration, of the Obama campaign versus, spending 8 years with the Republican brand as seen through the lens of the Bush administration and finding it wanting in a whole bunch of ways and going somewhere else. I think that was a defining experience for a lot of us who came up during that time. But I also think, it demonstrates how quickly things can shift, that the Republican brand right now has actually managed to move itself already fairly far away from association with George Bush, even though I don't think the policies have changed significantly, but the way people see those things has.
I would just add to that it's not just about the personality of Bush. It's about the values that are at the forefront, and the slide Scott showed are the two value dimensions where this generation is the most distinct are on social values, things like homosexuality and inclusiveness, and trust and confidence in government. And in many ways, the Republican Party brand that these folks grew up with was just defined by things that were just antithetical to them. But there are other dimensions that are not that distinctive. And if the debate and the discussion shifts to a discussion about the role of business in the free market, the millennials aren't that different in that respect. Even as Scott said, we didn't show the slide, but said, even when it comes to broader debates over the social safety net, they're not necessarily that distinctive or different or liberal, so to speak. So the Democrats have some core advantages on the two dimensions that have defined debate in recent years, social issues and sort of confidence, bigger trust in government kind of issues. But if the debate moves off of those issues or those dimensions, it's not clearly that much of a Democratic advantage.
Arguably, you could say that the biggest advantage in terms of underlying values that the Democrats have with respect to this generation are on the social issues, which have been completely off the radar for the past year. Yep. And so to the extent that people are updating their political predispositions based on what they're seeing out there, all the judgments being based on the perceived ineffectiveness of government in dealing with a very serious economic situation, and none of it on the social issues which were so important in the 2004 campaign and in other Republican campaigns.
And just before that gets set, it's social issues and foreign policy to some extent, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's two of the three kind of.
Mm-hmm. But even if social issues are not on the front burner right now, when you get to an election and choosing between a Democratic House, a Republican House, Democratic Senate, Republican Senate this November, and you think, are there changes that could result from a Republican majority? Is that something that young people are likely to shift their focus back to social issues if they think that there's some
I don't think there's any. There doesn't appear to be any space for that to happen in terms of the the campaigns are not are not likely to be talking about them.
And part of I'm sorry.
Judy, I think the social issue thing is really. You don't want to generalize. They're always going to be there and matter in ways we can't always predict. But that really is a boomer-driven thing. That really is about. That really is about peculiar and particular generation whose sort of anti-establishmentism and moral self-righteousness and cultural division dating back to the 1960s came to dominate American politics for a long, rather worthless moment.
Wow. Ouch.
I really, yeah. So I really don't think that, if we're talking about millennials here, but I really, again, down a sliding scale of generation, and I think Obama represents the leading edge of that. I really don't think those issues that I grew up with are going to have the potency in the political arena.
And one of the most hot
I don't think it's cyclical.
And one of the most hot button of those being abortion, which we see the millennials are, if anything, as conservative, if not a little more
For a wide
conservative.
variety of reasons, both
Right.
technological and just the evolution of social attitudes and the evolution of technology, where I think abortion is one issue where that really comes into play. There is a broader consensus among younger Americans than the sort of political parties would necessarily say there is, or then they would necessarily find they have an interest in acknowledging.
So if social issues are not going to keep the millennials connected to Democrats, what would? And again, I'm going to keep asking, what's the opening for Republicans to make headway?
I think that, when you're looking at the mix of social issues, things equilibrate, things change. So if you look at what someone who's a self-identified social conservative believes circa 2010 versus what a self-identified social conservative believes circa 1980 was very different. Ronald Reagan campaigned against incredibly onerous state initiatives, kind of banning, gay teachers from teaching in public schools. That's not on the map. 49 states permit same-sex couples to adopt children. Many people argue, including Chris Caldwell of the Weekly Standard, that that's when the gay marriage debate really ended, when you decided that gay parents are fit, quote-unquote, to raise children. And everything else is just this kind of long cultural lag that follows that. So I think that that's an important thing to keep in mind. I think Scott raised a very astute point. When you're looking at Obama's erosion, he already was fairly weak with non-college whites. Where has his erosion been? It's been happening with college-educated white voters. It's so far been relatively gentle, but it could accelerate. And that's interesting. And if the social issues were seen as more salient, maybe that wouldn't be the truth, or maybe that wouldn't be the case. One thing that I think is very kind of important to keep in mind about how Republicans are going to position themselves, how social conservatives are going to position themselves, kind of as we go forward, is that when you're looking at this survey, 21% of millennials are married, 12% of them have children. Now, when you look at any generation, the folks who have 3 or more children are the ones who are actually shaping that generation in terms of the next generation in terms of its sensibilities and what have you. I'd love to know the 20% who are married, the 12% who have children now, that is to say who are the ones who are getting started relatively early, what are their values like, where are they living, what kind of communities, what are their political sensibilities, how do they feel about the prospect of inflation and a variety of other kind of threats that are raised by the right. It's an interesting thing to think about.
But they're probably not having 3 kids anymore, I can say. Well, we might have to readjust the definition.
If we stop the home buyer's tax credit, maybe they can afford it.
And well, before we go to Michael and Scott to answer that question about, everybody get ready because I'm about to come to all of you for your question. Do you want to try to tackle what he just raised?
I mean, I have not looked at that in the new survey, but it's the case in all the surveys that married people are more conservative, more Republican-leaning than unmarried people. And for the kinds of young people who are getting married early, that pattern probably holds up. But we'll look at that.
Just to your question about, how do where do Democrats hold on to these folks?
Right.
I think when you have a generation that is less attached to kind of religious institutions and religious practice, yes, they may pray, but going to church less or synagogue or whatever, they look for meaning in other places. And I think part of what made 2008 a transcendent moment was it offered a story about national meaning that resonated with this generation. Bush also offered a story about national meaning, but it didn't resonate, I would argue, with most people who are millennials. But
Story
Obama,
being first African-American president?
No, about rebirth and renewal, about building a stronger America, respect in the world.
Working together. That was a big part of his theme, too.
Exactly. And I think that we've lost sight of that strand of the politics of meaning. So, there's an intra-Democrat conversation going on right now about do you kind of scale back and do small kind of incremental bits and pieces that everybody can like, or do you cast this large vision? I would argue to keep these people at least, you have to have some sense of kind of we are a country that is working in the world, building a green economy, addressing the ills that are happening elsewhere, and that's what this brand is about. I think if you lose that thread of meaning, people will go elsewhere for it.
So green economy and staying engaged in the world.
Green economies, and a foreign policy that reflects our values, but I'm deliberately not saying it's not issues. That's the point is people always want to break it down into issues. It's a vision, and it's a sense of where we're headed as a society that we're all participating in, that I think is missing, and that George Bush, although I disagreed with it, if you look at his second inaugural speech, definitely there was a vision there that people could relate to.
Well, I'm sorry.
All right, raise your hand. Get ready to call. I'll call.
Can I just jump in?
Yeah.
Just to respond to Rand's point and slightly correct it. 21% of this age group is married.
Paul.
21% of this age group is married. 34% of this age group are parents. 12% of this age group are married with children living in their household.
That's an incredibly useful and interesting point, because it also speaks to some of this incredible kind of class stratification when you're looking at family structure.
And then to your additional question, so what does that mean in terms of political values? I haven't looked at it all the way through, but I'm fairly confident in saying the 12% who are married and living with their children tend to be more traditional and more conservative across a range of political and social issues, as one might expect.
All right, great. Bill Schneider, and then we'll move around the room.
In the 1960s, China had a great proletarian cultural revolution. They got over it. In the 1960s, we had a great American cultural revolution, and we've never gotten over it. And we have been waiting for 40 years for the country to heal this red-blue divide that doesn't seem to end. We've had 3 presidents in a row, each of whom promised to end the division. Clinton, Bush, the uniter, not the divider, and now President Obama. And the division just keeps getting worse. My question is very simple. Do you, from your data, see any prospect that the younger generation will perpetuate this division or heal it?
Scott, you go first.
It's a great question and very difficult to tease out from the data. The one thing that we see in this interesting pattern of not seeing the liberalism of young people extending to what we in the baby boom thought of as liberal views on business is that you have a young generation that is in some respects more pro-government and more pro-business. I mean, there are questions in the survey that young people actually end up being less judgmental about business. So you have a mix of attitudes in here that doesn't conform to the current cleavage that divides Republicans and Democrats. I don't know if that will persist, but if it does, that's one step out of the baby boomer divisions.
Matt, anybody else on this, whether this is going to be the generation that ends the red-blue divide?
Well, the old saying was, which I would misattribute, so I won't, but that, old paradigms don't actually, generations don't adapt to new paradigms, they just die off. And I think it was an interesting thing. It kind of goes to the point I was just going to make, this interesting point about a vision that Eli was talking about. I think President Obama actually did in his campaign put forth a vision of where American government and American society needed to go. And I think among the factors that made it difficult for him to stay true to that vision during his first year in government, or at least to animate it from a policy agenda, was that he found himself hemmed in by very sizable majorities, committee chairmen, and very powerful congressional folks who were of a different generation and hadn't actually bought into that at all. Actually wanted to enact the same agenda they would have enacted 20 years ago had they been able to.
Members of his own party.
Only slightly updated. Members of his own party. Not his opposition. So, in a sense, I have come to believe, true or not, that this is simply a matter of the passage of time, that people of a certain generation are going to have to get out of the way, and they're obviously not going to do that voluntarily. And the sensibility of government and our confidence in government and our ability to reevaluate some of the divisions that Bill is talking about will, I'm quite confident, be strongly augmented by a significant generational shift that is beginning and coming, but simply not there yet.
Not only not get out of the way, they're living longer and hanging on longer.
Well, you said it. Yeah, I mean, I'm being as kind about it as possible.
All right, a question. Oh, anybody over here? I'm trying to mix it up around the room. Yes.
Matthew Continetti of the Weekly Standard. I'm fascinated by Gen X's affinity to Ronald Reagan, of all people. And it seems to me, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on the data, Mike and Scott, but it seems to me that it was more a reaction to the failures of Reagan's predecessor than it was perhaps a positive endorsement of the Reagan agenda. And so there I think we could also perhaps draw a parallel to the millennials' enthusiasm for Barack Obama, maybe perhaps responding more to the failures of his predecessor than endorsing the agenda of the National Democratic Party. And that might speak to the paradox that we see with this drop-off in support over the past year as well. I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, in that respect, the longevity of that bubble depends on performance, as it often does in politics. You know, if the affinities and affiliations we've seen in this generation now are to persist, they got to see the payoff. They got to see it work, and it's a combination of turning the economy around, you know, measurable, you know, things that people can feel and experience, but also I think following through on the style of leadership that you promise. You know, the issue of authenticity came up earlier, and I think it applies in all of this, that a return to the politics of the old is just going to leave people, you know, disenchanted even more, and I think that's, you know, the follow-through is really what's going to matter.
There's an interesting twist in the data that suggests that possibility is still there despite the bleakness of the party ID data for the Democrats, and that is that while job approval for Obama among millennials has dropped as much as it has among other groups. I mean, they still approve of him at higher rates than do other generations, but the fall-off has been as great. There's been virtually no fall-off in the favorability ratings of Obama as a person. So they still find him, presumably, to be an inspiring character and to embody things that they liked about him in the campaign, but they're passing a negative judgment on his performance right now.
And by the way, I think that is probably the strongest indictment, or one of them, of what they've done the first year in office, which I don't think is indictable on every level at all. But the idea that you retain that personal popularity and have neither converted it into support for your agenda, neither leveraged it into support for your agenda, nor particularly tried to leverage it into support for your agenda by going out and actually talking to people until the last 6 weeks or so. That I think probably in my mind, sitting here as sort of an armchair analyst, is the biggest mistake of that first year, because you clearly have the popularity to do it.
Who has a question over here? Jane Hall, and then.
Oh, sorry. A lot of my students were big Obama supporters. Ted Kennedy endorsed him there, and that's considered one of the great moments of their college experience. A lot of them feel that, just anecdotally, that Obama compromised too much. That's what I hear from them, that he gave it away. But I'm curious about issues. You said narrative is what is compelling, and that issues don't apply so much with young people. I'm wondering, do causes apply? Will young people vote around the environment? Will they vote around health care if it is reframed as a moral issue? What are the issues, or a draft? Some cynics think that the boomer generation turned against the war because there was a draft at the time. Are there issues around which young people of this generation will vote or not vote going forward?
If I may offer a cynical answer to that question, and this also relates to Bill's question from earlier on, I think that the reason why we have these very ferocious 50-50 politics, and we'll continue to have them for a long time, is actually structural. And I think that whether or not kind of these things are framed in terms of issues all depends on how political professionals are going to try to kind of reach out and activate different segments of the public. I think that actually, unfortunately, I think that the public is relatively passive in this. I think that when control of Congress became contested, when it became seriously contested, then control of the regulatory apparatus control of whether or not you can extend various tax provisions that sunset or don't sunset, suddenly became very, very valuable. And so you saw an explosion in the size of the lobbying sector. You saw an explosion of the amount of money that goes into campaigns, whether directly or through independent expenditures. And I think that it is a structural change. Many of us in this room work for organizations that are funded by wealthy donors who are perfectly good people who want to do good for America and are great, and we all love them. But at the same time, it's all a way of kind of shaping things that are not through the traditional press, shaping issue environments to kind of reflect your kind of ideological beliefs and what have you. It's a very complicated environment, and I think that that's why it's always going to tend toward 50-50 because, whether it's timber and mining and gas interests or it's private insurers, the value of being able to control that regulatory apparatus is so powerful that you're going to see all kinds of different, and again, you can be perfectly earnest if you're the politician who's taking part in the system, but you're going to get an efficient outcome. So Scott earlier was talking about how social issues have become less salient. Part of it is that given the composition of the Senate, given that it's not a one-man, one-vote institution, Democrats have to win some folks who are pro-life and who are, kind of favor gun rights and what have you. So, I mean, that actually constrains their ability to make some of those arguments, to make some of those claims. And again, it's because what is the efficient outcome in a competitive political marketplace? So I think that, we will see causes, we will see all kinds of things, and there's going to be a rich process of experimentation because we have a federal system. But I think that there's really no moving away from that basic 50-50 dynamic because the incentives for it are so strong.
Can I speak to one other piece of the puzzle, I think, going back to my obsession with form and going back to the question about the red-blue divide? I think part of how you'll begin to solve that problem is by changing the structure of governance to make it more permeable and of this era.
Example.
Well, I mean, here's a crazy idea, but why not have Congress telecommute a lot of the time? Mm-hmm. Why not have it rooted in the communities all around the country instead of here? That wasn't possible 250, 300 years ago. It's possible now. And maybe the affiliations that people had with their home districts would be stronger than some of these affiliations with interests that are running around in buildings like this one. I think there are a lot of ways that structural change actually could inform politicians having a more rooted sense of, I actually have real people out here that I represent versus buddies who are lobbyists and who run interest groups. But why not, do that? It's not working as it is. I mean,
it's funny because older hands say the exact opposite. They say that back in the old days when Washington, legislators knew each other, they looked after each other's kids, they loved each other. It's funny. It's a generational break how you look at that problem, I think.
Yeah.
All right. Question over here. Let's see. Right there. All right. You get a second one, Linda Wertheimer.
I was going to say that I do think that the red-blue divide is a structural question, but it's not quite in the way that you framed it. I would say that it's a question of how congressional districts are drawn. And as long as we have gerrymandering, we are not possibly going to, mend any of this. It was possible not even very long ago for a real political tsunami to wash the Senate completely out and to substantially change the House. That's not possible now. You can't get that kind of flood now because so many of the seats are completely safe. And unless we all suddenly, have some kind of mental breakdown and turn into Iowans, I don't see how that changes.
I think that's actually a very optimistic view, but maybe it's right.
Good point.
There's a lot to be said for all. This goes back to the last question. I mean, the gerrymandering is an issue, the structural placements, but on a very basic level, I disagree with all of that. I mean, I think it's all a factor, but politics, in my view, otherwise I wouldn't do what I do. Politics is about ideas. It has always been and always will be driven by ideas. The power of interest, the power of structural pieces, the power of the people who draw congressional maps, the power of lobbies is the power to fill a vacuum of modernization and creativity that exists in our political system. And absent that modernization and creativity by political parties and political actors, those interests are able to gain a tremendous amount of power. But someone who actually sets about to transform the country, a party, or more likely, I think, for reasons we talked about, a person, who actually has a modernizing agenda that is not dogmatic, but is actually points a way forward toward the future, will transcend that, and it may not build, for all the reasons of party loyalty we discussed, may not build a 30-year majority, but can certainly have the impact on the country that ideas and actors have always had.
But you would acknowledge it's harder because of gerrymandering, districts drawn to protect parties, and because of things like the
I think all those things contribute,
regulatory changes,
but are likely balanced. I mean, I don't know to what extent all of those things contribute to that environment, but how much are they balanced by the ability of an internet and a television for a leader, for a thinker, a creative thinker, to reach people directly and make that case? They didn't have that in 1950. So I don't think it's the structural factors of the environment that dictate. I think it's a complete generational lack of imagination.
All right, we're going to come back to the millennials. Heather Smith with Rock the Boat.
Hi, thanks, Judy. It's nice to be here. It's a really interesting conversation to be talking about how the Democrats maintain strong party ID amongst millennials, when what I was hearing from a lot of the data that you all just presented was that their party ID wasn't that strong to begin with. There's just a small few that actually identify with it, and then a larger subset that, sure, they lean Democratic, right? But the other side of that is that they were candidate-driven. They were anti-Bush. They were pro-Obama. The stableness in all of this is that they have really stable progressive values and that they have a really stable favorability of Barack Obama personally. And so all that makes me think that maybe there is something in this, that it was about the fact that Barack Obama spent a ton of money, time, and resources talking to young people, talking about the issues and the values in a way that was relevant to them, going to their college campuses, using the forums and the media and the medium and the technology that was actually familiar to them, and investing them in him as a candidate and as a person. And so they ultimately voted for Obama, not for the Democratic Party. And so, yeah, it doesn't surprise me that their party ideas dropped. I don't think they've seen the Democrats do those same types of things in the governing process this year. I actually don't think they've seen Obama do those types of things. So I'm a little surprised they're still maintain that strong favorability, but maybe that's where the job performance comes in. So I guess that's my take and what I see from the nonpartisan side and from working with young people every day. But the question that I would find, well, I'd love to know what you're seeing in the data, has to do more with their participation. So because I don't think party ID is that big a deal after hearing all of what you said, unless you're trying to build a majority for the Democratic Party for 30 years, I want to know what in the data is showing whether or not they're going to continue this upward trend of 3 major election cycles in a row of participation. And that's never been party ID, right? That's been following the news. That's been talking to their friends about politics. It's been paying attention, sending emails to a member of Congress, signing petitions, all these kind of civic participation indexes. So has there, since you've been tracking this over time, maybe looking at 06 to now, since the midterms is relevant, any data around participation that we can look at?
I'll take a shot at it, but I would like to ask you the same question since you're involved in efforts to mobilize. I mean, it's a huge unknown at this point. We know a few things. We know that in 2009 there were 2 gubernatorial elections in which the proportion of young people in the electorate was far smaller than it had been in 2008 or in 2004 in those 2 states when you compare the presidential year election with the off-year election. Now, it's not surprising that young people would drop off. I'm not talking about absolute turnout. All turnout was down from 2008 to the 2 gubernatorial elections in 2009. But young people relative to older people fell off a great deal. What we don't have is good comparative data from the gubernatorial elections of 2005 or 2001 because there weren't exit poll numbers that we can find that we can rely on. There aren't even good exit poll numbers from 2002 congressional races in those places to be able to say, have young people fallen back into the pattern that was more characteristic of the 1980s and 1990s rather than in the latter part of the last decade. The other thing is that we, at least institutionally, do not attempt to gauge engagement and turnout at this early stage of an off-year election cycle, because we don't think that it's reliable. We think that the forecasts that are being made now about Democratic disillusionment and pullback, while you can make a good case that it certainly hurt the Democrats in the special election in Massachusetts, are not particularly predictive of what the situation is going to be in November. So I'm sorry to punt the question, and if you have evidence that you'd like to bring forth, that would be great to hear. But I don't know of anything that I can rely on to make that kind of assessment.
Heather?
I can just say real quick, our registration rates haven't dropped. So, and then they all come at the end, right, when there's a political moment. But today we'll still register a couple thousand people to vote around the country. And those rates haven't dropped off, so people are still turning 18 and coming to us to register to vote. So that seems to be favorable. When I look at Virginia, EJ has left, but I thought EJ Dionne did a great piece in the Washington Post that night immediately afterwards, and he said, you can't expect the Democrats and Craig Deeds couldn't expect to win an election or at least mobilize young people in that election with nothing spent but a fancy ad a few days out from Election Day. And so, what I'm seeing is that they're still paying attention. They're still doing their thing. It takes work and energy, and if the candidates invest the money and if we continue doing our thing, I think we'll be able to continue turning them out because, they're still just as angry and just as optimistic, and the hard work just needs to get done, would be my guess.
Okay, we've got time for maybe a couple of more questions, one or two. Right back there, yes.
To defend Neil since he had to...
Can you give us your name and organization?
Sorry, Dan Coates from Y-Pulse. Birth years 61 to 81, Matt, are Gen X. Barack Obama's a Gen Xer, which in the context of the culture wars of boomers would maybe put a bit of a different light on the whole notion of when do we get beyond the culture war.
Well, but some people cut it off at 64, which would be his last year. Isn't that the traditional demographic?
I have to defend Neil just because he's the keynote of our upcoming conference. Howe and Strauss,
does
61
someone
to
attack
81.
Neil? Because I think his work is great. I don't know. I'm not...
Sure, 61 to 81 is what Neil says. I don't know who says something different.
I think
we follow Howe and Strauss.
Character assassination if Neil has to stop.
I don't want to misrepresent anything.
Absolutely.
If Neil wanted to be defended, he should have come here and done it himself.
All right, we've answered all other questions. Is that right? Okay, over here. And before we go to you, I do have a question. How much do we know about political attitudes, male, female, men versus women among this generation? Scott, Michael, anything to add? Is there anything distinctive, anything worth?
Same patterns that we see in other age groups.
I mean, you're still seeing some gender gap in some key political values, and it carries over into voting and leaning, with women being a little bit more democratic and
but no notable difference from the others. Yes.
Thank you for your time today. It's been very interesting. I'm Maureen Wiebe with the American Association of Christian Schools, so I work with young people and appreciate very much your insight. My question goes to the research and data regarding the social issues, and you defined them as being the family issue and homosexuality and civil liberties, but then, Judy, you mentioned that abortion is also a social issue, and millennials tend to, from the data I've seen, tend to be more conservative. So I'm wondering if that was one of the issues that you included in your research, and if so, did that have any bearing? I know the research you have and you have shared shows millennials to be more liberal, but then if they're more conservative on the abortion issue, I was just wondering if that was one of the issues included in your research and how that played out or affected your analysis.
Yeah. Let me speak quickly to that. Abortion was not one of the questions in the values series that we've asked since 1987, so that's not included. So when I was showing you the greater liberalism of young people, it was not reflecting attitudes on abortion. And it is true that there are very small or no generational differences on abortion questions, and that's been true for a long time. There's also been very little trend in attitudes about abortion. Last year, in a series of surveys that we did, we detected a slight uptick in conservative sentiment about abortion. But We also detected a small generational difference appearing for the first time, or let's call it an age difference because we don't know if it's generational, in which young people actually were somewhat more pro-choice. And those data are included in the 9th chapter that deals with religion and values in the report, and you can take a look at them. So that's sort of where that stands.
Okay. We've one last question. This is it, and then we're going to turn to Andy Kohut to help us wrap the day up.
Thanks. My name's Tobin. I'm with the Center for American Progress. I had a question going back to specifically the data over the past year. So, we talked earlier about how Democratic ID, whether leans or not, has decreased. Obama's his approval has decreased as well, even if people still like him personally. But at the same time, you also have data showing that general satisfaction with the direction of the country has increased pretty significantly. And I was just wondering sort of how you reconcile the two and what you think is happening there.
Satisfaction. Well, the satisfaction hasn't increased a lot. I mean, people are still a little glum about where it's going. The young people are more satisfied. Yeah. So, I mean, I don't have a good sense of that. I mean, I think the issue in 2008 is that you're really hitting such a low, and it's interesting that it's even before the real crumbling of the economy in September and October. The public sensed it even before then. They saw the mortgage crisis. They were feeling a lot of those factors even earlier, and you saw that satisfaction really go down. I'm not sure. I think that Obama's election, you certainly saw the politics of it flip, where prior to Election Day, Republicans were more satisfied with the country than Democrats, and immediately that flipped around, and Democrats got very satisfied very quickly. A lot of that is just the internal kind of flip-flopping of politics really shaping people's outlook on the country, both in the evaluation of the current state of things and into the future. So.
Just one quick addendum on that. When you think about the group that's been hardest hit by unemployment, et cetera, it's probably African Americans. And this is a group that actually has been unusually supportive of the president, just as President Bush had a kind of hardcore of conservative evangelicals in the Mountain West and a couple of other regions who continue to support him pretty much come hell or high water. It's interesting that one of the groups that has proved most economically vulnerable is actually one where it seems the president has a kind of fairly strong visceral connection.
All right, terrific. As I thank the panel, I'm going to ask the leader of the Pew Research Center, Andy Kohut, the president of the Pew Research Center, to come up and help sum up the day. He and I chatted before this last panel, and I think we agreed, Andy, that this was not going to be an easy thing to do. Let's thank the panel. Terrific panel. Thank you all for being here.
Is this working?
I think it is. Oops. So testing 1, 2, 3.
Pretty daunting challenge to try to summarize and give you some reaction to what I've heard all these hours. I had a pretty good sense that you would find the data interesting, and all due in modesty. But the contribution and the value added by the panelists, I just thought was terrific. I was basically an observer here, and I learned so much listening to the smart people who commented on each of these panels from beginning to end. And really, that's what I'd like to quickly focus on. In the first session, I got a better sense of what kind of people this generation consists of, and I began to think that this is the generation that will contend with the challenges and crises of the first part of this century. And I called over to the office and I said, look up the birth dates of all of the presidents through 1960. Or through the 1950s, and found out that if we had done this panel 100 years ago, and there were smart Alecs like us who could give generations names and stuff, we would have called FDR, Ike, and Truman millennials. MacArthur would have just made it, or just missed it. Hoover, Harding, and Coolidge would have not made it. And these very successful presidents were millennials 100 years ago, and they had the right stuff for the challenges of the 20th century. And if you look at the values of this generation as they were articulated today, here's the kind of people that are going to lead us into this next century. They're confident. They're open to change. They're diverse, and they're open to diverse points of view. And they have solid family values. And those are pretty important, impressive. That's an important, impressive set of social values. Politically, they're more trusting of government. They're more positive. And they are much more tolerant. They're less disposed to an assertive military national security, and how these values play out in the way this generation leads us to deal with the issues of this coming generation, it will be something to see. I learned an awful lot from listening to Neil Howe in particular. And he gave us, I think, a great explanation of the confidence that's so evident in the data when he said this was a sheltered generation. They expect things to be okay. And in the face of all of the hard times they're seeing now with regard to unemployment, it hasn't really rattled their self-confidence because they were pretty well protected, perhaps less well protected, much more protected than previous generations at comparable points in time. Listening to the second session on media and information, I think that for many of the attitudes and behaviors that we study, we can look at what will happen to this generation as it ages and maybe make some guesses and assumptions about the aging process and its impact on attitudes and behaviors. That's not going to happen with respect to media and information because the whole thing is moving so quickly that the projections are not easy to come by, if not impossible. And I think someone made the very smart observation that it is this generation that's driving the nature of that very fast-moving change. And you see it in a comment such as blogging was so 2007. Another point that struck me was that the speed of information and the way we exchange information has its virtues, but its consequences are not so well understood for this generation. And I like the idea of the concept of the first Facebook president. In terms of just down and dirty politics, I think that one of the aspects of the decline in President Obama's approval ratings among this generation and the impact on the Democratic Party has to do with what has been the driver of President Obama, the principal driver of Obama's overall decline in approval rating. That is the unemployment rate. Nothing is correlated with Obama's declining approval rate as the accelerating rate of unemployment. The curve of this looks exactly the way Reagan's did, 81 to 1980 into 1982, and it has affected millennials just as it's affected the entire population. But keep in mind that when you ask someone in a survey in bad times, even a group of people disposed to a political figure, do you approve of the kind of job this president is doing? It's pretty hard to say, I approve. But large percentages of millennials still say, we have confidence in him. And so you have to kind of understand the difference, what these various kinds of measures mean. I guess I'll close by saying we talked about the lack of engagement, the great engagement in 04, 06, and 08, and the fall off in 09 so far. not so far in 2009 and what will happen in perhaps what will happen in 2010. And I think we can't underestimate the impact of President Bush. We've talked an awful lot about President Obama, but President Bush is gone. And a large part of what we saw, I believe, with respect to the mobilization of this generation had to do with reactions to Bush, negative reactions to Bush. Judy, I'm going to leave it there.
I think that's great. And the only question I would have in addition to that is I assume there's still material that Pew wants to look at about this generation, that there are still questions out there and will continue to be about the millennials that Pew will want to turn over and
absolutely. Not only will we continue to analyze this data, and this data will soon be available to all of you to analyze, but we're going to continue to track this.
Thank you very much for leading this, and thank you everyone here for being with us for this whole day. It's been an extraordinary privilege for me, and I wish you all well. And you're invited back to the next Pew Conference on the Millennials?
Indeed.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. That was great. That's terrific.